Thanks for checking out the Open Sky Fitness Podcast with Rob Dione. Rob is a personal trainer certified by the National Academy of Sports Medicine. He's a corrective exercise specialist and a performance enhancement specialist. Rob is also a level 1 CrossFit instructor, but he is not a doctor. If you got any injuries or medical issues, go see a physician. And when it comes to working out, it's always best to have a trainer watch your technique to get you started. So be careful, don't sue us, and enjoy the podcast. All right, let's do this thing.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to the Open Sky Fitness Podcast. I'm Rob Dione, and I'm here to tell you that no matter where you are in your life, you can always be healthier. And we're here to help you get there. Okay guys, so if you have questions about your own health and fitness, or if you have questions that you want us to ask our guests for you, write us on Twitter and Instagram at Open Sky Fitness with the hashtag AskOpenSky. You can also email me, rob@openskyfitness.com, or go to openskyfitness.com and you can leave a voice memo right there on the tab on the right side. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I have an awesome show for you today. I had a conversation recently with a fellow named Stephan Guyenet. Stephan wrote the book, The Hungry Brain. Stephan's background is in neuroscience. He basically studies the way in which our brain reacts to food. And it's fascinating. It's such a fascinating deep dive into this conversation because we think we have so many, there's diet plans that we just need to follow. If we could just exercise more, if we can do this, do that. And Stephan's approach is a little more from the history of the way in which we have evolved as humans and how the way in which we eat, we've never eaten before. And so over the last, since maybe the 50s and 60s, we have never in human history had access to the amount of food that we've had recently. And how that has really messed with the way in which we try to maintain our body weight, the way in which we organize our lives, and having access to this food really does kind of make it pretty difficult for a lot of us to live a healthier lifestyle. So we're going to dive into that conversation with Stephan in just a few minutes. I wanted to share something with you guys that was actually pretty awesome. It was something that made my week last week. A fella that I went to college with, Oz, is a listener of the show. And sometimes I forget that people I know actually listen to this podcast. And so Oz gave me a call the other night and left me this voicemail. And it was the sweetest thing ever. Oz has been struggling with his weight. He and I had a conversation, probably a year or so more ago about weight loss. And we've had text message conversations and such. And I like I said, I forget that Oz listens to the podcast. Well, anyway, Oz left me a really nice voicemail. And I want to share that with you right now because it goes to show that changing your lifestyle doesn't have to mean now you're a gym rat, you exercise all the time. Oz was able to achieve a certain weight. And keep in mind, he's going to mention his weight in this, but keep in mind that I think Oz is somewhere between he's taller than me. He's somewhere between 6 and 6'1", I assume. Oz, I'm sorry if you're like 6'3". I apologize. But I think he's somewhere between 6, 6'1". And Oz and I went to college together. Oz, I think, has got a few years on me. He's probably in his mid to late 40s. But he's been struggling with his weight. He's had some back issues. And he's on the mend. And he's actually lost a lot of weight. And I want to cut to this little voicemail that Oz left me. The sweetest thing ever. Listen up.
What's up, Rob? Hey, man, I just wanted to call you. I knew I was going to get your answer machine, but I wanted to leave you a message to let you know that I think, I sent you that message. I had been listening to your podcast, man, and I got to tell you, it's what really got me going, even though I'm still trying to binge on it. But, man, got down to 189 today. I went to the doctor, had my physical. I hadn't checked my weight in a while. 189. And I got to tell you, it's all because I really was listening to that podcast and listening to a lot of the guests that you had on there. And I haven't even been to the gym. I've been stretching and, I think I've been to the gym once, but I haven't been doing any weight training because I'm trying to, get my back better. And so I've just been taking it easy. But one thing, what you always hear about is like 98% of it's in the kitchen. And I could not agree with that more. Because because since I've changed my diet, I've been able to just keep, losing the weight. And, it's pretty exciting, man. I was so excited when I got that news today. And I'm sticking with it. So anyway, I just want to let you know, man, that, a big reason for that is, your podcast. So your podcast is really working and it's doing its thing and, it's making a difference. I think obviously with myself and I think a lot of others. So appreciate you doing what you do. All right, brother. We'd love to come get a cup of that coffee at your house. Take care, man. I'll talk to you soon. Sorry for a long message. Take care.
So I just want to say, Oz, dude, that was such a nice voicemail. It really made my night. Sometimes, I'll be honest with you guys, sometimes I do this show, I send it into the abyss, and I don't know what kind of reaction it's getting. And sometimes I ask you guys for reviews. Sometimes I'll ask you to post in the Open Sky Fitness podcast group. And, sometimes it's crickets back. Sometimes I don't really get much of a response. And this was a really nice surprise. It was validating. It was, it brought me a lot of joy to hear that what Devin and I are putting together is really helping not only Oz, but other people as well. So thank you for that, Oz. That was very, very sweet of you. You didn't have to do that. But, you did the work. You listened to the show, but you did the work. And that takes that lifestyle change really is all you. So kudos to you. Hats off to you. Job well done. Keep up the good work. If you ever need any more advice, feel free to shoot me a text or give me a call. I'm happy to help. So that's it. I just wanted to share that with you guys before we jump to this conversation with Stephan, because that was kind of cool. And I think it's a little inspirational for everybody else to know that people can just apply the stuff that they're learning here. They don't have to hit the gym. They can drop weight and start feeling really good about themselves without having to become a gym rat and really be like this fitness buff. I'm throwing up the finger quotes right here. So anyway, Oz, thank you so much, buddy. And all right, let's do this. Let's jump into this conversation with Stephan Guyenet. All right, guys, I have Stephan Guyenet on the line right now. He is a researcher and science communicator who specializes in neuroscience of eating behavior and obesity. He's the author of the book, The Hungry Brain, which is a Publisher Weekly Book of the Year of 2017 and called Essential by the New York Times Book Review. His common sense scientific approach to nutrition is refreshing in the current dogmatic dieting environment. He is also the founder and the director of Red Pen Reviews, which publishes the most informative, consistent, and unbiased reviews of popular health and nutrition books available. If you like what you have to hear today, you'd like to geek out a little bit more about Stephan, then check out his website or check out Red Pen Reviews. All right, Stephan, let's jump into this. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Okay, thanks for having me, Rob.
So, okay, I want to know, just kind of, let's give a little bit of an origin story here. I like to start there. You started out as a biochemist or studying biochemistry, but then you somehow shifted into a little bit more of a neuroscience kind of. It seemed like you were a little bit more kind of leaning in that direction, even when you were biochemistry. What caused that?
Yeah, so I always had my eye on neuroscience, even when I was studying biochemistry. My idea was to give myself a foundation to move into neuroscience and have a really good grasp of the, molecular underpinnings of it. So I've always been interested in neuroscience, even from a young age. The brain is not only the organ that makes us who we are. I mean, many things make us who we are, but I think the brain, most people would agree, is the main thing. And it's also one of the greatest remaining scientific frontiers. I mean, we have so much to learn about the brain. There are a lot of parts of the body that we know a lot more about than the brain. And so it was an exciting area to me, even from a young age, and it still is.
Is it purely scientific for you, or is there something personal that you were trying to overcome at some point?
It's mostly scientific. I mean, I'm just a scientist. I was born a scientist, and I've been, along that path for pretty much my entire life. But, I mean, there are some things that kind of nudged me in that direction. We have some Alzheimer's disease in my family, and so understanding why that happens Initially, I actually did my PhD work in neurodegenerative disease. Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disease. And so that was my initial path, but I decided to move into obesity once I started to understand how important the brain is to body fatness and eating behavior.
I've had Amy, oh man, I'm going to forget her name. I think her last name is Berger on my show. And she specifically talks about Alzheimer's. And there's really no improvement once you're kind of gone down that path. Is that one of the reasons why you felt like maybe you couldn't necessarily help people, or it was a real small percentage of people that you could potentially help?
Honestly, the main reason, I wasn't studying Alzheimer's disease. I was studying another disease that is much less common called SCA7. It's a genetic neurodegenerative disease. It's related to Huntington's disease. That's the disease in that category of polyglutamine diseases that's most common. But essentially, so I wasn't studying Alzheimer's disease. There were no labs at the University of Washington that were studying Alzheimer's disease, at least in a way that was interesting to me and my career goals. And so basically part of my decision to move into obesity was wanting to work on something that had a greater impact. So obviously Alzheimer's disease does have a huge impact, but I wasn't studying that. I was studying this rare neurodegenerative disease, and I wanted to do something that had a greater impact.
Got it. Okay. So you were blogging for a really long time, and actually your website that I mentioned, or that I don't think I mentioned in the opening, StephanGuyenet.com has a ton of really great posts. So if people are listening and they want to check that out, they should really go and take a look there. Your book. So you've been working on this book for a long time, and it came out last year, or actually 2 years ago, 2017, I think, right? The Hungry Brain. What was the impetus behind that? And can you give a little bit of an overview of what the book is about? Because I've been diving into it over the last week, and it's chock full of so much great information that you must have been gathering for years.
Yeah, absolutely. This book is the culmination. It's my magnum opus. It's the culmination of basically a great big model of how the brain regulates eating behavior that I've been putting together for, throughout my years of studying neuroscience and obesity and eating behavior. So my kind of informal goal for this book was to create a comprehensive model of why we overeat that explains, through the brain pathways that occurs in, how, why we eat too much, why we consistently eat too much, why we gain fat. And why our brain pushes us in that direction even though we don't want to. That's the really weird thing about all this, right? And that requires explanation is most people nobody wants to overeat, right? You don't want to gain fat. You don't want to increase your risk of chronic diseases. You don't want to look worse in a bathing suit in the summer. Excess body fatness has all of these consequences that we don't want. And yet we go down that path anyway. So, why is it that our eating behavior betrays our best intentions to be lean and healthy? And that's pretty unusual, right? Basically our hands and forks aren't really doing what other parts of our brain want them to be doing. And so essentially what explains that is we have these non-conscious brain circuits that evolved in our distant ancestors to regulate their food intake and body fatness in an ancestral environment that was very different than the one we live in today. So we have brain circuits that regulate our hunger. We have brain circuits that regulate our cravings, brain circuits that regulate how full we feel at a meal, and other things as well that relate to our eating behavior and body fatness. And these things, we don't really think about it because, things that are non-conscious in the brain, by definition, we don't have direct access to it. So we don't really think about this. But, where does hunger come from? You don't decide that you want to feel hungry, right? That's just something that wells up out of your brain under certain circumstances. You don't choose to have a craving. You don't say, hey, I feel like craving a brownie right now, so I'm going to crave a brownie. No, that's something that wells up from non-conscious parts of your brain, and then you experience it, and have the opportunity to act on it or not. But that impulse is not something you have conscious control over, and you don't have conscious access to the processing, to the information processing that leads to the generation of that motivational state. And so these are non-conscious functions being regulated by non-conscious brain regions that we inherited from our distant ancestors that were shaped by the conditions that they lived in that were very different from ours today. And so basically, when I was researching, both by reading the literature and by doing experiments myself, when I was researching the neuroscience of body fatness and eating behavior, there is so much information out there that explains why we do what we do. And we don't understand everything. We still have a lot to discover, but we do know a lot. And the thing that was so crazy to me that made me want to write this book is that most of this information wasn't reaching people. I mean, researchers knew about it, but even researchers, only like a really narrow slice of my field really knew what was going on with this stuff. You go a little bit outside that, even within the obesity research field, and a lot of people don't really know what's going on within the brain circuits that regulate eating behavior. And so this was information that was so important, so impactful, that we knew so much about that the public was getting almost none of. And so, to me, it allows all of these harebrained theories to proliferate about what's really going on because the real information is not out there. And so I felt very lucky, very privileged to be the person to write this book. I think it was going to get written at some point, just kind of a comprehensive treatment of the brain circuits that push us to overeat, or I should say somewhat comprehensive overview. Of course, there's a lot that I left out. But just asking that question, asking that broad question, why does the brain drive us to overeat? I'm really the first person to treat that in a broad manner for a general audience. And again, I feel very lucky to have been the person to be able to write this book.
And, you mentioned in the book, and from an evolutionary standpoint, we haven't been eating this way, but for a very, very, I think you say like 0.008% of the time in which human beings have been kind of developing on Earth. This way of eating, this opportunity to have these kinds of high calorie dense meals and just food was never available to us as we were evolving. And that's, I guess that's part of what you're going to go into, and I love that you're bringing this up and that you're the person who's kind of like leading the charge on this. So break it down a bit. Let's talk about like what's happening in our brain. Why are we having such a hard time maintaining our weight or stopping from eating?
Yeah, so I think there's three big factors that are happening, and there's probably many more too, but I think at a high level, there's three big factors. One of them is that we have brain regions that regulate our motivation to eat, kind of our cravings. And that is regulated in large part by the neurotransmitter dopamine. And basically, our food today, we can get into more detail, but our food today causes more dopamine release than the food that would have been typical for our distant ancestors, just because of its composition, and we can talk about that. So we have a greater kind of craving drive. Food is more seductive to us. Second, modern foods in industrialized nations are not very filling per calorie. And again, that relates to their composition, and we know pretty much how this works. We know why that is. But food is not as filling per calorie, which means you have to eat more calories to reach that point of fullness that terminates your meal. And the third thing is we have circuits in our brains that actively regulate our body fatness. A lot of people don't know this, but it's been pretty well worked out how this works. Again, there's still remaining questions, but in broad strokes, we pretty much know how the system works. And essentially what happens once you have gained fat and you've become overweight or obese, developed overweight or obesity, your brain starts actively defending that higher weight. And this is a key reason, this may be the main reason why weight loss is so hard, and it is probably the main reason why people tend to regain some or all of the weight after they have an initial weight loss, because you actually have systems in your brain that are regulating your body fatness, and they're saying, no, I don't want you to lose fat. I want you to stay fat. And so you have these three, and these are all centered in non-conscious brain systems that we know a lot about how they work in terms of what cells are connected to what and what neurotransmitters they're releasing and what effect those things are having. So these are, this is not speculation. This is actually how these brain systems work. And basically all three of those things together are pushing us to overconsume. And the thing I want to really emphasize here is that these brain systems are just doing what they evolved to do. They're not screwing up, they're not broken. They're just responding rationally to the inputs they're receiving from the food that we eat and from the food environment that we live in and from the lifestyle that we live. This is how you would expect the system to respond to these inputs coming in from what they're receiving from our lives.
In what way is our brain telling us, no, stay fat? In what way is that not a broken? I know it's not, but describe why it's not a broken system. Describe why it's what the body wants to keep that weight on.
Yeah. So essentially, we have a system that works a little bit like a home thermostat. So your thermostat, you set the temperature on it. Let's say you set it to 70 degrees. What it does is there's a thermometer in there that measures the temperature in your house. And whenever the temperature deviates from 70 degrees, it kicks in a compensatory response to bring it back to 70. So if the temperature drops down to 69, the thermostat says, okay, I'm going to kick on the heat to bring it back up to 70. And if the temperature goes up, it kicks on the AC to bring it back down to 70. So this is called a homeostatic regulatory system, or a negative feedback system for the engineers. And this is a really basic type of regulation that happens in many systems, both in man-made systems and in biological systems, that's intended to maintain the stability of a system. And so we have a system like that regulates our body fatness. Essentially, instead of a thermometer in your thermostat, what you have is a hormone called leptin. And leptin is circulating in your bloodstream proportionally to how much fat you have on your body. So the more fat you have, the more leptin you have, and your brain measures the level of leptin in your blood to tell it how much fat you have, just like the thermostat measures temperature to tell it what the temperature is. So, and what your brain does is it has a certain amount of leptin that it's kind of looking for, that it's expecting, kind of like how your thermostat is looking for 70 degrees. And if your level of leptin deviates from that, particularly if it starts to drop when you lose weight, your leptin goes down and your brain says, hold on here, wait a minute, this is outside of the range that I'm trying to defend. And then it will kick in compensatory responses. Just like your thermostat kicks in the heat to bring it back up to 70, your brain has a whole suite of responses that it activates. Like it makes you more hungry, it increases your cravings, it reduces your metabolic rate. And so it does all of these, it does everything it can to get more calories coming into your body and to reduce the number of calories leaving until your fat goes back up and your leptin goes back up, and then your brain feels satisfied that you're back where you should be. And the thing that sucks about this system is that the level of body fatness that it will defend can actually increase over time. And so, a lot of people have had the experience, folks who are maybe out of their 20s now, maybe in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, maybe have had the experience where when they were younger, they just could effortlessly maintain a thinner weight. But now that they're older, it's actually a lot more work to maintain a thinner weight if they're able to do it at all. And so the kind of system, the comfortable weight, quote, comfortable weight that your brain is trying to guide you towards can change over time, and actually can change in the positive or negative direction. And so the thing that sucks is that in most of us in industrialized countries, our defended level of weight increases over time. So your brain kind of wants you to be fatter and fatter and fatter. And I think that's a result of our diets and lifestyles, because it's not something you see typically in non-industrialized cultures that are living more similar to how our ancestors lived. And if you want to dig into more detail on that, we can do that, but I'll just leave it there for now.
No, I love where you're going, and I do want to dig into it. But I do have a question at this moment. So you keep saying it sucks, but is there? And you mentioned that there is a possibility to bring it down, right? And to basically reset the thermostat. So if you're stuck at 70, and 70 for you is 300 pounds, how do you bring it down to 65?
Yeah. So
or is that the big question?
Well, it is a big question, and I think we have partial answers to it. So I think I want to just spend a moment talking about the phrase you used of resetting the thermostat, because I think I just want to define that a little bit. It's not a bad term to use, but I want to make sure people understand how I'm going to use it. Okay. Because it doesn't mean wiping the slate clean so that suddenly your brain wants to defend the weight that you were when you were 18. Mm-hmm. But you can shift it. I think that's probably a better way of thinking about it, is you can shift the weight that your brain is defending from where it currently is. And you can do that either in the upward or downward direction. So, just to make sure everybody understands what that means, usually we have this weight that we're just kind of settling at when we're not trying to gain or lose weight. There's just kind of a comfortable weight that we're settling at, and that's usually fairly stable in most people. So, over the course of a year, people won't usually fluctuate more than a couple pounds. Of course, there are exceptions, but that would be typical. And so, and this is true even for people who have excess body fatness as well as people who are lean. And so, that's kind of what I'm talking about. That's the regulatory system. That system I described is what underlies that relative stability of weight and fat. And so that comfortable level of body fatness can change in the upward or downward direction. And essentially, it can probably relate to several different factors, but I think the number one factor is the type of foods that we eat. So there are several factors that are either known or suspected to move the so-called body weight set point, which is that point that your body is defending. Yeah. So we know that if you take animals or if you take humans and you put them in a setting where they have very easy access to calorie-dense, highly palatable foods, rich in carbohydrate and fat, so basically a wide variety of really tasty foods rich in both carbs and fat that you can eat as much as you want to, and they're right in your face all the time. When you put animals or humans in that setting, they will overconsume calories pretty dramatically, and they will rapidly gain fat. And I describe this in my book. And
yeah, you have a really great example of that, of these two guys who had access to a vending machine.
Yeah, that's right. It's more than two guys. It's actually three separate studies on a number of different people.
Got it. I think you only talk. There's only like reference to two guys. One guy gained like in 1 week, he gained like 7 or 8 pounds, and another guy, one guy ate 270 calories more, and one guy ate 144 calories more per day. So they were just over consuming as much as they could, but it was only referenced the two. So that's why for some reason in my mind I thought it was just two people.
Yeah, I think you might be thinking of a different part of the book. The part with the quote unquote cafeteria diet study. I think what I reported in the book is that the group, as an average, increased their calorie intake by 73%.
Oh, yeah. The one that I'm referring to, that was it.
You might be thinking of the liquid diet.
That's right. The guys drinking out of the straw that were just drinking paste.
Yeah.
That I want to talk about, too. That's really interesting. But we'll get there.
We can definitely get to that. Actually, you know what? I'll work it into my answer to your question here. So basically, and this is extraordinary. I mean, eating 73% more calories than normal. That is extraordinary. When you have overfeeding, there's tons of overfeeding studies in the scientific literature where they try to get people to eat like 50% more than they normally would eat. And you have to give people all kinds of enticements. Like, You have to pay them money. You have to sit there and watch them and cheer them on, and they're just like stuffing it down and their stomachs hurt. I mean, most people don't want to eat 50% more calories than usual. That's a lot of calories. These people did it spontaneously. This wasn't even an overfeeding study. Nobody asked them to eat 73% more calories. This wasn't a study about fat gain or obesity. This was just an observation they made that was unexpected. So, yeah, essentially, just to describe it a little bit more, they were in an inpatient setting, which means they were actually in a research facility. They were basically locked up for a week so that researchers could closely observe exactly what they were eating and exactly what they were doing. And they had access to these sort of giant vending machines that were full of a variety of different calorie-dense, palatable foods. And so any time of day, anytime they wanted, they could just saunter over and hit a button, and they had, French toast and sausage and this wide variety of whatever they want. It's basically like living in a buffet.
Did they have access to healthy choices as well, or no?
There were a couple of things. I think there was like apples, but there wasn't a lot of food that I would consider to be very healthy. Certainly most of it was fairly calorie dense and processed.
In your opinion, in terms of the study, would you have rather have given them that access to see the choice they would make?
I think that would be interesting, but that would be a different
study
question. Yeah, different study, different question. And anyway, they replicated this in men, they replicated it in women, they replicated it in people of different races, and every time they did it, people just overate like crazy. And so not always 73% increase, but always they overate by a lot more than they needed. And so this is kind of a microcosm of the modern food environment. I mean, we have easier access by far to more calorie dense, more palatable foods than ever before in human history. So basically that experiment was kind of an extreme example of the kind of like food stew that we all live in every day. And, there's many things that are good about that, of course, like, starvation is pretty uncommon in the modern United States relative to, our distant ancestors. But at the same time, it has a lot of downsides, as we can see with obesity rates now up to 40%. Lifetime risk of obesity is over 50%. Anyway, I'm rambling here. Let me get back and focus on the question.
Tighten it up.
Yeah, but essentially, what we see in both these human and animal studies is that these people were gaining fat rapidly, and they were not stuffing themselves. They were spontaneously overeating and gaining fat. And I think essentially my way of interpreting that is their brains, because of this food and how that was interacting with their brains were basically saying, yeah, we really like this food. We really love this opportunity to eat it so easily. So we're going to crank up the thermostat a little bit. We're going to say, yeah, we can pack on some more fat to allow us to take advantage of this awesome opportunity. I think on some level, that's kind of the logic that the brain is doing, which is a logic that makes a lot of sense in the context of our distant ancestors where these types of opportunities were rare. It's like, yeah, take advantage of it. Let's eat a bunch, get these nutrients, get this fat on the body, and that's going to make us more fit to survive and reproduce in this challenging environment that our distant ancestors were in and that our non-conscious brain still thinks that we're in. And so
let's don't lose that train. But there was just to go off of that. There's that you were mentioning the indigenous tribes, and there was an example in the book about this hunter who went off and hunted, and before he went back to the community, he would eat the most fatty and most nutrient dense parts of the animal before coming home. And it's almost an example of when you have access to something so nutrient dense, you consume as much of that first, and then you start consuming the things that are less nutrient dense or lesser caloric value, because you don't know how long that's going to last. Is that basically what's being triggered in our minds as we have access to these things?
So if you look at foraging behavior, in other words, how an animal or a human goes about getting food in a wild setting, what you see is that foraging behavior is very centered around acquiring calories. So you can predict an animal or human hunter-gatherer's foraging behavior to a reasonably good degree just by knowing how many calories are there in all the different foods in their environment, all the different potential foods, and how many calories do they have to spend to acquire those foods, and how much time does it take. So basically, if you calculate the calorie return rate, then you know basically what a hunter-gatherer is going to do. Are they going to go after the big game? Are they going to go after the antelope? Or are they going to maybe go after the rabbits? Or are they going to climb a tree and get the honey? Or are they going to pick the berries? Basically, if you know the calorie return rate, you know a lot about what kind of decisions they're going to make about those food sources. And so when you have a situation where there's a super high calorie return rate available all of a sudden, like they come across a tree that has tons of really ripe fruit, or a big bee's nest with lots of honey in it, or they have an opportunity to kill a really large animal easily, what you see is that they will stuff their faces. And I'm not an anthropologist, but I spoke to anthropologists researching my book, and I read books about from anthropologists on hunter-gatherers, so I know a little bit about what's typical. And when they have the ability to eat lots of tasty, easy calories, they go crazy. So, for example, Kim Hill described to me with the Aceh hunter-gatherers, he has observed them drinking up to 1.5 liters of honey. So that's more than 1/4 gallon of honey at a sitting. One individual just downing more than 1/4 gallon of honey. He has observed people eating 30 wild oranges that are similar size and sweetness to our typical grocery store oranges. He has observed people eating up to 5 pounds of fatty meat at a sitting. And so basically when these easy wins are available for them, they take advantage of it. And guess what? It's actually good for them to do that. That helps their survival and reproduction in the challenging environment that they live in, where it's hard to get food. It takes a lot of work to get food, and you don't know how much food you're going to have available tomorrow. So this is something, this kind of like economic reasoning is very deeply rooted in the human brain, and it's been rooted in our ancestors for many millions of years, because any animal that has to make decisions about which food to acquire in its environment and how to do that has to make these decisions. So this is deeply, deeply wired. So in the modern food environment, the calorie return rate of all the stuff in the grocery store is massive. You spend 10 minutes, I don't know, let's say 20 minutes in a grocery store, and suddenly you could have tens of thousands of calories or hundreds of thousands of calories immediately available to put into your mouth. Yeah. I mean, that is radically different than anything a hunter-gatherer experienced. And so yeah, I think that's part of it. So I want to get back to your question about moving the set point, because okay. I think this is something people are really going to be interested in. I talked about how it moves up, but I want to talk about how to move it down, because I know a lot of people want to hear that.
Right.
So essentially, there are a few ways that I strongly suspect that one can move the defended level of body fatness down. So in other words, turn the thermostat down so you feel comfortable. So your body is actually actively trying to take you to a lower body fatness and feeling comfortable at that lower body fatness. I think there are ways to do this. And I want to, just be honest with people that we don't have really definitive evidence. But what we do have is indirect clues that suggest that it is possible. So what you look for when I'm looking for strategies that lower the set point is I look for strategies where when someone adopts them, they spontaneously lose weight without actually trying to eat less. So they're just naturally eating less or naturally expending more, and their body is getting leaner, and they're feeling comfortable. They're not getting hungry and sluggish and cold and feeling bad and having unmanageable cravings. They're just kind of feeling normal and feeling good, and their body fat is declining. So that's kind of a sign. If you're in that position, where you're losing fat, but your hunger's not going up, your craving's not going up, and you're generally feeling good, that's, to me, is a pretty good indirect evidence that your set point is declining. And that's really what we want for sustainable, durable, comfortable fat loss. That is the situation that we want to be in. You want your regulatory systems to be aligned with your conscious, positive, constructive weight goals for yourself. And so there are a few different ways that this can be done. One way that's pretty common and popular is macronutrient restriction. So restricting carbohydrate intake or restricting fat intake. What you see when you, in studies where people restrict fat or carbohydrate intake, spontaneous calorie intake goes down. In other words, even if people aren't trying to cut calorie intake or restrict calories, it just spontaneously goes down. People naturally eat a little bit less, and their weight goes down and kind of, stabilizes at a somewhat lower weight. And so that's one way to do it. Another way is to eat more protein. You see a very similar thing as you see with carb or fat restriction. When protein intake goes up, people's total calorie intake goes down, their body weight and fat goes down, and they feel comfortable, and they feel that their appetite is controlled at that lower weight. That would be a typical response. Now, of course, it always differs by individual. Sometimes you have to experiment a little bit, but that would be the typical average response. And, there are a couple other things I talk about in the book that I think are important, and one of them is diet palatability, or really what I'm talking about is more like seductiveness. How seductive is the food that you're eating? If you're eating, if food is really seductive, if it's food that really creates cravings in you, a strong motivational drive to eat, if it's food that tastes really amazing to you, these are things that are going to tend to promote overconsumption. And it's a sign that on a intuitive, instinctive, non-conscious level, your brain really, really values that food. And when your brain really, really values a food, it finds ways to get you to eat more of it. And it kind of pulls out, it kind of lets up on the brakes that would normally stop you from eating. So you feel less full per calorie that you've eaten. So your brain kind of turns down the satiety knob in your brainstem. So you're feeling less full for every bite you're eating. And there's decent evidence, not conclusive, but there's decent evidence that your set point goes up. So the more seductive the food is, the more your brain loves that food. Your brain kind of says, hey, I'm going to let you accumulate some more fat because this is a wonderful opportunity to eat this incredible food and get these nutrients and store a little bit of extra fat. And so essentially, those are some of the things related to our food. So how seductive is our food? How much protein is it? And what are the levels of carbohydrate and fat in that food? In addition to that, there are a couple of other lifestyle-related things. So if you're not sleeping enough, if your sleep quality is not good enough, that can also play into it. That could, better sleep could lower your calorie intake and set point a little bit. Worse sleep could increase your set point over time. And then psychological stress is another thing that can play into it.
Right, and that, you cover that in a couple of the chapters in the book. Okay, so in terms of like strategies to lower that set point, the things you're talking about is macronutrient adjustments, proteins, higher proteins, potentially lower carbs. There's so much debate in the nutritional world. It's just so mind-boggling, and it's frustrating. And I think that the understanding, because I think that what people don't understand is because let's say there's somebody who's 300 pounds and all they think about is high caloric foods. It's almost impossible. And then there's somebody who's got a low set point and they don't even think about high caloric foods. Like I'm trying to figure out for the person who's really struggling, like what are some of the strategies they can take to start kind of moving away from like always thinking about cheeseburgers or pizza or ice cream?
Yeah. So
because like you said, like this is really about how our brain functions. Our brain is telling us what we need and what we want. And it's hard because, like you said, you walk down the grocery store aisle and you have access to hundreds of thousands of calories. You drive down, I drive down La Brea and I'm passing McDonald's, Burger King, KFC. Everything is on like I can down 2,000 calorie meal if I stop for 2 seconds and just like pull up to the window. So how do I stop that compulsion when it's so driving and so and so strong?
Yeah, that's right. And the reason it's strong is that these types of foods tend to cause a lot of dopamine release in the brain by virtue of their physical and chemical properties. Mm-hmm. And if you want, we can get into more detail about exactly what the properties are about those foods that cause dopamine release. But essentially, the bottom line is that these foods cause a lot of dopamine release, which causes intense motivational states that you feel as a state of craving. And that's a big part of why we eat too much. We're driven toward these foods. Like we feel that craving pull toward pizza or brownies or ice cream or whatever it is. I mean, think about you're at a restaurant and you've just had a savory meal, let's say, I don't know, steak and a baked potato and a salad, and you've had plenty of savory food, you're full, you don't need any more calories. In fact, maybe you've already overconsumed calories. And suddenly the dessert comes out and it's a brownie right out of the oven and you can smell it and it's got vanilla ice cream next to it or whatever dessert you would enjoy. And suddenly, all of a sudden, you really want to eat that despite the fact that you have no need for energy anymore, no need for calories, and you're already full. But suddenly you're not feeling so full anymore, and you feel this craving to consume that food. So the reason, at least part of the reason for that, is that these foods just cause a lot of dopamine release in the brain, and when you eat them and you experience that dopamine, your brain stamps in this motivational state toward these foods. And so when you're driving past the fast food restaurant, for example, your brain remembers what that means. It remembers what the golden arches means. It means that if you go in there, you're going to get this huge calorie dump and a lot of dopamine. And so it starts to fire up when you see those cues, like, for example, seeing the golden arches or smelling the smell of brownies baking in the oven or seeing the sight of a pizza box. All of those sensory cues start to fire up your dopamine again and can create very strong motivational states depending on who you are and other factors. And so, yeah, so that's that was just me expanding on the problem that you're talking about and explaining how it works a little bit.
Yeah.
So what to do about it? Essentially, we have to curtail two things. First of all, we have to curtail our exposure to these cues that trigger our dopamine release and our motivational states. In other words, our craving. Get rid of those cues that are the triggers. The same thing. It's the same thing you do when you're trying to quit smoking. You don't leave a pack hanging around your house. You don't go to the convenience store where you normally would buy cigarettes. You don't hang around people who are smoking. You eliminate those cues that will trigger your desire to smoke. It works the same way with food. I'm not saying that pizza is as bad as smoking cigarettes, but there's similar processes happening in the brain that is pushing us toward both, and we deal with them in a similar way. So what you need to do is create a supportive food environment for yourself where you're not being exposed to those cues all the time. So maybe currently in some people's kitchen, there's food that's visible on the counter that's calling to them every time they walk past it. Maybe it's a bag of chips, maybe it's soda, maybe it's a box of, cookies or fudge or something that's been left out. When that visual cue hits your brain, it starts to get your dopamine firing up, and all of a sudden you're going to have a craving, you're going to feel hungry, and it's going to be a struggle for you not to indulge. So if you don't have the cue there, you won't experience that motivational state, at least much less of one, and you probably won't even think about it.
So I want to build off of that for a second because I want to give some somewhat of a practical application of it. So what you're saying is change your food environment, which means that don't have that trigger foods around those things, or even maybe it's, you don't maybe now go out and call that buddy that you would normally go out to drinks with, and then the next thing you know, you guys are like eating pizza and buffalo wings, and life is, everything's kind of rolled downhill. So like what you do is you kind of eliminate that, and then I would imagine when you're talking about dopamine, then it's almost like it's drugs. I mean, it's a drug. It's a chemical release in the brain where you basically lose somewhat control. So the longer you're away from it, the easier it will be to kind of abstain from it for periods of time. So because there's somewhat of I'm throwing up air quotes of like an addiction there. Because of how strong it is and how tied in it is to your personal kind of upbringing and the way in which it kind of what kind of hold it has over you. So if you were to stay away from it from longer periods of time, you're starting out with maybe creating a food environment and then really trying to stay away from pizza, all of those high calorie foods. There's so much conversation in the nutrition world and about cheat meals, things like that. Is that just a recipe for disaster when you're talking about that kind of dopamine response for some people?
Yeah, I think with an emphasis on some people. I tend to think I don't work with clients, so probably people who do might have greater insight into this, but I tend to think about it as there's two types of people. There's the moderation people and there's the all or nothing people. And the moderation people can build a lifestyle where, 80-90% of the food they eat is supporting their goals, and then they have pizza sometimes and it's okay. The all or nothing people are people who, if they eat that pizza, they're going to lose control. It's going to send them into a downward spiral, and they're not going to be achieving their goals anymore. And so those are the people who have really high reward sensitivity and just need to break the cycle. And so, I think that for that type of person, it is helpful. And certainly from the neuroscience perspective, it suggests that it's helpful. And it's the same thing as cigarettes. If you're trying to quit smoking cigarettes, you don't go down to 80%, you go down to 0%.
Right.
And when you do that, what you see is that people, at first, they'll have really strong cravings, and it'll be really hard for them for the first, week. Actually, I think it's hardest for the first couple days, and then it gets a little bit easier, and then it gets a little bit easier, and a month into it, it's not that bad anymore. And then after a year, they think smoking is gross. Yeah. So that would be like the typical trajectory that I see in people who quit smoking cigarettes. I mean, people after a year, they're not usually still struggling with smoking. Usually at that point, the war has been won. And so I think, and so the reason is it relates to some pretty well-established psychological principles, is that if you don't keep reinforcing the reward association, if you don't keep releasing that dopamine, your brain gradually basically forgets that reward association. So those cues, like the cigarette on the counter, that used to be very potent because you're constantly reinforcing them with dopamine, once you have stopped reinforcing them with dopamine for an extended period of time, they don't have the same pull over you. So if you haven't had a brownie in 2 years and you smell the smell of brownies coming out of an oven, it's probably not going to have the same effect on you as if you were eating brownies every week and you smell the brownies coming out of the oven, or pizza or whatever. So yes, I think that avoidance is a tool in the toolbox that can be useful for some people. But I think you have to put it in the context of adherence, because this is why I mentioned that other type of person, because, some people, they just aren't going to stick to really restrictive diets. So if you tell them, no, you shouldn't ever eat pizza, they're going to say, screw off, and then they're just not going to do anything.
Right.
So I think adherence really is a very important goal that we have to manage. So that's why I mentioned that issue of two different types of people. But another issue I want to bring up, one thing that we have to clarify as you and I are comparing these foods to drugs is that dopamine is the normal and natural response to eating food. So if you eat an apple, you're going to be releasing dopamine. If you eat poached salmon, wild caught Copper River salmon, you're going to be releasing dopamine. If if you're eating kale with, some oil and salt on it, you're going to be releasing dopamine. The difference is that some foods release more dopamine than others. So dopamine is a very natural response. It's a good thing. It should be happening. But some foods release a lot of dopamine. And the more dopamine you have that gets released, the greater the motivational response in your brain and the more cravings you're going to experience and the harder it's going to be for you to control your eating behavior. So it's really a spectrum. With on one extreme end of the spectrum, you have foods that are very rich in combinations of sugar and fat and starch and salt and glutamate, which is that umami, MSG, bone broth type of rich, meaty flavor. So foods, and these are things that we intuitively understand push us to overeat and that are hyperpalatable and that we have a hard time controlling. Things like pizza and ice cream and French fries and bacon and those types of foods. Those types of foods tend to release a lot of dopamine by virtue of their physical and chemical properties, really just often combinations of fat and carbohydrate with salt or sugar or something else that really are unlike anything that our distant ancestors would have eaten, and that I would argue our brains are not really calibrated to, because these are, the foods that our distant ancestors ate were not releasing this amount of dopamine. If you look, one thing I like to have people understand is that if you look at the diets of hunter-gatherers, how our ancestors lived for almost all of our evolutionary history, they are radically different than how we eat today. Yeah. Hunter-gatherers, they weren't putting, grating cheese on things. They weren't sauteing onions. They weren't even doing controlled temperature baking. Like, they were taking chunks of meat and throwing them in the fire and not putting anything on them, or burying them in the sand next to a fire with some coals, and then pulling them out and eating them just like that, burnt on the outside and practically raw on the inside, or just eating raw berries, or digging up tubers and cooking them and eating them plain. They weren't sauteing onions. They weren't putting added fats and added sugars on things. The diet of hunter-gatherers was extremely simple. And the diet included carbohydrate and it included fat, but they weren't using these refined added versions of it and using it as flavorings to tickle their palates. It was a very utilitarian type of diet. You find stuff, you process it to the extent that you need to make it edible, and then you eat it. So, I think for people in the modern environment who are used to having their palate be entertained by everything that enters their mouths, this is a radically different type of diet, but that is the diet that our brains evolved to respond to constructively and to thrive in. So even though it's normal for our brains to release dopamine when we eat food, and again, it's not just food, it's like sex and a lot of the other things that our brain intuitively views as valuable cause dopamine release, and that's how it should be. But when you get too much dopamine release, you get these destructive behaviors like overeating or like drug addiction, that sort of thing. I mean, caffeine it activates the same pathway as addictive drugs. It's a habit-forming drug, but it's not a big deal. It just activates it a little bit. It doesn't seem to really hurt people's health. So caffeine's not a big deal. So same thing, if you eat an apple, it's going to activate your dopamine pathway, but that's not a bad thing. It activates it just a little bit.
Yeah.
Then again, if you're shooting heroin or if you're taking meth, then you're getting a massive surge of dopamine in your brain, and that's going to lead to excessive motivational states that are going to cause destructive behaviors. And same thing with food, pizza and French fries and ice cream and all these, modern delightful foods that tickle our dopamine release. These things just cause so much dopamine that they lead to excessive motivational states that can be hard to control. and that cause us to engage in destructive behaviors like overeating food. And, make no mistake, like overeating is not like something that's going to kill you real fast, but over time, it's a very destructive behavior. I mean, that causes a large chunk, possibly even the majority of the health issues that we face in the modern United States. And so it's a highly destructive behavior over long periods of time. And it's one that we are pushed towards by this excess dopamine, just like we're pushed, if we take heroin or cocaine or whatever. And now I'm not trying to say that overeating is as bad as shooting heroin or smoking or whatever. I don't think it is, but the mechanism there is similar. It's excessive dopamine release in the brain. That is not the only mechanism, but that is a mechanism that drives us toward these foods. And if you look at the primary sources of calories in the American diet in the modern United States, they're all foods that are predicted to release large amount of dopamine because they're all kind of calorie-dense, palatable combinations of carbohydrate and fat and salt.
Yeah. And it's, and as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about, going back to our ancestors and the way in which they would have eaten. And then a study that we didn't actually come back to, which I think is a good time to revisit and actually touch base on, was when those fellows were sipping through a straw, foods that were very, very bland and told, eat whenever you're hungry. And they, in fact, brought down their calorie count significantly comparatively to their set point calorie, intake, and they immediately dropped weight. And that makes me think, because there's so much happening here, because I would imagine from an evolutionary standpoint, we didn't have access to high calories all the time. So as you said, whenever we did get access, it was acceptable. In fact, it was healthy for us to basically binge on it as much as possible, get as many calories in as possible, because who knows the next time you're going to get access to that. So is there, it makes me think, because I can't remember where I heard you speaking of it and that you hadn't tried it, but maybe you were going to think about trying it. And I think it was Rob Wolf who he had asked if you had ever tried intermittent fasting. And at that point, you hadn't tried it, but you were considering it. And I'm curious if you think that intermittent fasting, in a way, obviously not when you're eating McDonald's and stuff like that, but being able to eat a little bit more in one sitting, kind of scratching that itch, for lack of a better term, of wanting to really eat and consume, and then for the rest of the time, basically giving your body a break and going into a little bit of a ketogenic state. If that's a scientific way in which it would happen.
So let me make sure I understand what you're asking. Are you saying, would it be a good strategy to not really worry about what you're eating, but just restrict your eating window? I
would never say it's not good. Don't worry about what you're eating. Always focusing on whole foods would be an optimal amount, an optimal thing. However, in terms of the amount of food that you're consuming when eating whole foods, don't worry about the off switch, like pushing the plate away or moving away from the table because you feel like you're overeating. If you have access to, whether it be chicken, steak, vegetables, even potato, but the least processed as possible, and basically fill up on that as much as you feel capable of filling up on that, and then you can walk away. But if you're doing it with a sense of time restricted eating, maybe, or some kind of intermittent fasting built into it, would that be a good strategy for somebody who's basically trying to maybe turn the corner?
I think it's a strategy. Yeah, I mean, I think it probably there's not really a lot of good evidence on this right now. Okay. Honestly, on time restricted feeding, the evidence is really quite limited to these really small, not very convincing studies in humans, I should say. In rodents, it's amazing.
What do you mean?
Time restricted eating in rodents is actually pretty great. If you put them on a fattening diet, they won't get fat often if you restrict the eating window. So,
I think in your book you said that rodents' digestive systems are the closest to humans in the animals, or that we do study. Is that true? Or
I don't think I've said that.
I thought I read that in your book.
Say it. No, rodents have some pretty important differences in their digestive tract than humans do. Anyway, so the human data are really thin. But I mean, I tend to think that any strategy that helps people eat less without having to track their calorie intake is something that could be useful. So, I mean, I think it's a perfectly acceptable thing to experiment with, having a restricted eating window. And according to some definitions, that is how I normally eat. So I usually have dinner around 6, and then I'll have breakfast around 7. So I have a window of about 13 hours where I don't eat, and there's no snacking or anything after dinner. And I think that's kind of an important thing about this, because a lot of people, they overeat because they're snacking between meals. If you cut out all that snacking, they wouldn't be overeating. And they might even be undereating. So I think time-restricted feeding might just be like a fancy way of stopping yourself from snacking.
Right.
And to that extent, I think it could be helpful. There's also been some suggestions that having a long period of time where you're in negative energy balance, in other words, you're dipping into your body's energy reserves instead of building them up, is just good for you hormonally. Like, instead of having all of these anabolic hormones circulating at higher levels like insulin and leptin, you are having low levels of those for part of the day and kind of giving your body a break so that it can maintain kind of better hormone sensitivity. That seems plausible. I haven't really seen research that clearly supports it. It certainly seems plausible. So, I mean, there could be some health benefits. I think the bottom line is, though, that we don't really know a whole lot about how effective that is in humans at this point.
Got it. Okay. I mean, I know that there's so many different I guess, nutritional guidelines and gurus, I guess, that are like one that pops into my head is Bulletproof, where they're trying to move people into more of a ketogenic state, utilizing intermittent fasting and drinking lots of copious amounts of butter and coconut oil or MCT oil. But and that's actually, maybe this is a good segue in terms of wrapping up too, because I appreciate your time and you coming on the show, and I'm sure you have things to do. But one of the things that I really liked about your website, Red Pen Reviews, right? Because I just started diving into this just as we were having our conversation. You do these great reviews on books that are very, very mainstream nutrition books that people will be finding on Amazon and reading. And you basically do a scientific breakdown. Why don't you actually describe what this is? But one of the books that you talk about that's in here on the first page is Bulletproof Diet. And you give it an overall score of 50, scientific accuracy 34, reference accuracy 70, and then healthfulness a 43. Just in terms of that book, can you talk about what all that means?
Yeah. So first of all, those scores are out of 100, just to give people some context.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me take a step back and just explain to people what this organization is. And one thing I want to just clarify for everybody is that it's not just me. We have a team of, I think, 10 people now, all experts in nutrition and or eating behavior and obesity, who have at least a master's degree in an area of expertise relevant to the books that they're reviewing. So essentially what Red Pen Reviews does is it publishes expert book reviews of popular health and nutrition books that are more informative, more unbiased, and more consistent than anything else that is currently available. So what I noticed, what I and others noticed that really frustrated us, is that it was really hard for people to judge the information quality of the health and nutrition books that were being published. And, it's hard for people who don't have a background in nutrition. It's hard for people who do have a background in nutrition, because oftentimes, because you can't know everything, right? So if a book comes out on a topic that's related to nutrition and weight loss, maybe that's a topic that you haven't really looked into yet. So it can be hard even for people who are knowledgeable in the general area to evaluate books like this. And where do you get high quality evaluation? Do you look at Amazon reviews? Well, those are basically useless. Almost every popular book has an Amazon star rating between 4 and 5.
Right.
It doesn't matter how non-evidence-based it is, how terrible or unhealthy the advice is, it's going to have it's going to have good reviews on Amazon if it's popular. And then there are reviews on websites, on newspapers and things like that are of variable quality. But most of the time, most of the high-profile reviews, like in major newspapers, are generally written by people who are not experts. They're not going and checking references to make sure that the statements in the book are accurately representing the evidence. They're not doing little mini literature reviews to see if the author is cherry picking or if they're, if they're being accurate about portraying what the evidence as a whole says. So there's basically all of the stuff that's available to us paints a really limited window into the information quality of these books. And so consumers, including even knowledgeable people, really don't have an effective way in most cases to separate the wheat from the chaff and determine which books are worth purchasing and reading and which are not. And so what we said is, hey, we're scientists. We're going to start applying the scientific method to this. So we have a system that includes peer review, that includes random sampling, and that includes other semi-quantitative scoring and other elements that we drew directly from science. And we're going to update book reviews for the 21st century. We're going to do a really deep review on these books that's checking references and looking at the scientific literature that is totally transparent, where you can see everything that we did. And we're going to package this in a format that's really easy for people to understand and grasp within seconds. So you land on the page, and immediately the first thing you see is score bars for the overall percentage score, then for the 3 subscores of scientific accuracy, reference accuracy, and healthfulness. And within just a few seconds, you've already got really useful information about the evidence quality of that book that you can directly compare to other books. So you can say, hey, excuse me. You can say, hey, this book got an overall score of 50%. Let's say I'm interested in low-carb diets. This book on low-carb diets got a score of 50%. This other one got a score of 80%. Hey, maybe I should read the one that had 80% because that's the one that is most evidence-based and has more healthful diet advice. So that's kind of how you can use these pages. And then below those percentage scores are our summary that just real quick tells you how the book scored. And then below that is the full review where we go into complete depth with page numbers and quotes and references, and we explain exactly why we gave the book the scores that it receives. And the whole thing is very polite. We're not attacking the authors. We're not here to tear anybody down. We're just trying to be clear and honest about what the information quality of the book is.
Got it. It's great. I've already added it to my bookmarks as a source. I mean, there's nobody else doing this, which I think it's a really great resource if you're listening to this and you want to start picking up some books that you can now trust the scientific background of of your choice. Then definitely check this out. redpenreviews.org, not .com.org. Is there anywhere else, Stephan, that you would want people to reach out to you? And if they have any questions, is there ways in which they can get in contact with you?
Yeah, so my personal website is stephanguyenet.com. I haven't really posted much lately there, but that has my contact information if anyone wants to contact me. I'm also most active on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @WHSource. That is, that's the place where I'm most active. I just share research and discuss research mostly.
There's obviously so much more that we could potentially be talking about, but I just wanted to, if in the future maybe we can have another conversation, because I think that there's more to cover, and this is such a deep topic and such a complicated topic for a lot of people. to wrap their brains around. So I'd love to invite you back at some point to come on and have a further discussion, especially as we get feedback from the audience. But just to say, I want to say thank you so much for coming on. This was really great. And I learned a ton, and I hope that, and I know that, I should say, a lot of other people are going to learn a lot from you as well. So thank you.
Okay, thanks for having me on.
One more time, thank you so much, Stephan, for coming on the show. Super, super insightful. Guys, make sure to check out Stephan's book. You can buy it on Amazon, The Hungry Brain. I highly recommend it. It was one of those books, one of those nutrition books where I'm flipping through and I'm literally just going, I just loved every bit of the information because it was just so straightforward, so no nonsense, and so science backed that it really did resonate with me. So I highly recommend you checking it out. I also recommend checking out the redpenreviews.org website that he had mentioned, because I've been perusing on there as well. There right now, obviously, there's not many books. If you have the means, please donate to his website and support them, because as he said, there's no money really being made on this. It's just a whole bunch of people that are enthusiasts, scientists, enthusiasts that are writing about these books and really giving you guys the lowdown on whether or not this is something that you should take seriously or if it's just hype. And so I think that this is a fantastic thing. I hope that they build this up, and I hope that it gets stronger and stronger over time. So, Stephan, thank you so much. And guys, please check that stuff out. And again, and also a thank you to, call back to the beginning of the show, thank you to Oz for that fantastic voicemail, dude. You're the best. That was super, super cool. Guys, we're going into the 2020 season, right? The spring season. Devin and I are due to have a baby. The reason Devin's not here right now is because she's taking a nap. We're due to have a baby. I'm not even kidding, in like 2 weeks. So I'm going to hopefully crank out a few episodes in a very short amount of time that we will stream out in the coming weeks and months. And so if there's anybody that you'd like me to start putting on the list to interview, please feel free to reach out to me. You can do it via email, rob@openskyfitness.com. You can also go into the Open Sky Fitness podcast group on Facebook, and please feel free to request to join the group if you're not a member there. We're happy to have you. And if you are a member, feel free to post in there and let us know who you're looking for. We have a little bit of a lineup for the spring lineup. I have next week. I have actually 3 podcast interviews lined up, and as you know, we post every other week, so that's almost a month. That's a month and a half, and then the following week, I think I have 1 or 2 as well. So we're cranking out a bunch of episodes, and something that I'm looking for now. We've done a ton of nutrition. We've done a ton of workout stuff. We've done like a lot of just like overall fitness and nutrition, right? That feels like so much of what Open Sky Fitness is. But some of the things that I've been leaning into now and has had a huge impact on my life has been mindset work, meditation, daily practices, things that have had an impact on my outlook on life and the way in which I approach my day to day. And I'm generally, since I've been doing this since December, and I'm not even kidding, I'm not even hyping this, like I'm generally in a better mood. I feel like most days are completely manageable, and I'm excited to go out and get it. Go out and attack that day. I've read fully, like cover to cover. I read books for this show all the time where I'm kind of skimming and gathering information and then, taking notes and then delivering it to you guys. I do that all the time. So for every guest that I have on, it's not very often that I will actually sit and read books that have nothing to do with fitness. And so I've read over the last month and a half, since mid-December to now, 2.5, I guess that's months. I've read 3. I'm on my 4th book. And every morning I wake up, it's part of that Miracle Morning conversation like I had with Devin for you, that I shared with you guys, the first episode of the season of the new year, where I wake up every single morning, either at 4:15, at the latest 5 o'clock, and I will read for 20 minutes to 30 minutes, meditate, journal, and also visualize my future. In a sense, it's almost like a visualization type thing, and it's had a huge impact on me. And I highly recommend it for you guys. So part of that realization is that I'm inspired by people that are into making life-changing advancements. So if you know or have any advice for me in terms of who you think would be a good guest for our show, somebody that I can dive in deeper with that conversation, then please feel free to reach out to me. Hopefully they've written a book. Hopefully they have something going besides. Sometimes I get a bunch of messages about, oh, I've got this personal trainer friend that's fantastic. Oh, I've got this and this. Those people are great, but generally I want somebody that's kind of got like a proven method, or somebody that's been a little more seasoned, I guess is what I'm looking for. Somebody that's been around doing this for a longer period of time and is actually sharing what they've got, because my hope is that when I have them on the show and you as the listener are inspired by them, you can take action and actually read their book or follow what they're doing online or their social media or something, where it's not just, oh, that inspired me for a moment, but there's no way for me to get any more information or have access to that person because they're a personal trainer or a therapist or somebody that is kind of isolated in their own world where they only work with people one-on-one. So those aren't necessarily the right people for my show, but people that have done things and that the audience can have access to once they've had an interview on my show. Those are the people that I'm looking for. So if you have any recommendations in that world, I'd love to hear it. Well, I think that's it. All right, guys. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I really did have a fantastic conversation with Stephan, and I hope to have him on again. I think he'd be great. And Oz, if you have any more updates, leave me a voicemail, buddy. I'd love to share it. All right, guys. That's the show. Guys. Thanks for listening to the show. Tune in next week. We have another awesome Open Sky Fitness podcast for you.
All right. Thanks for listening to the Open Sky Fitness podcast. Please check us out on Instagram at Open Sky Fitness, where you can follow Rob, link to the podcast, learn about upcoming guests, and post questions for him. You can also ask us questions about your own health and fitness, and we'll try to answer them on the show. For our blog, show notes, and more information about training with Rob Dione, go to OpenSkyFitness.com. Our music is by H. Scott Salinas. You can check him out at hscottsalinas.com.
So for Rob Dione and the rest of the Open Sky Fitness team, this is Jeff Meacham saying that no matter where you are in your life, you can always be healthier. And we're here to help you get there. All right, I'm done.